30. 30. Yeah, this is it. We'll be on. Me just shouting.
We're underway in 1 minute, okay?
Wow, a lot of people came back. Yeah, because you had 30 seconds where you're shouting 90.
Welcome back, and welcome to everybody again, and welcome to everybody online who's following us. Glad you're here. Now, we're moving on to the next piece of what we want to do, which basically looks at the policy implications, the conclusions and the policy implications, both at national and local level for the results that we have seen already that the index actually reveals. So, over to Colette.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. As Sean said, what we're going to run through now is some of the conclusions and the policy recommendations that we've made based on each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So we've made them at a national level, but also on a local level to capture that fact that everybody has that role to play here. So generally, the well-being of people, both now and for future generations, is the goal of public policy. And the SDGs, because of the fact that they provide a blueprint, they should be integrated more into policy work to develop this more sustainable future. Examining our performance relative to our peers, and we talked a lot about why we examined ourselves relative to the EU 15, is absolutely essential if we want to know where our challenges are and how we might look to address them. So, moving in terms of the actual recommendations, in terms of SDG 1, we're looking at no poverty. So how do we eradicate poverty in all its manifestations? At a national level, we would recommend the revision of targets set out in the Roadmap for Social Inclusion. So that was published in January of this year, having had an almost 2.5-year hiatus. But unfortunately, it just does not go far enough. In fact, there will be roughly the same amount of people in actual numbers living in poverty at the end of the lifespan of that roadmap as there were in 2018. So it just doesn't go far enough. In order to move towards that goal of eradicating poverty, we've done a lot of work in terms of basic income, refundable tax credits and a living wage. And these are things that we really need to be moving towards to guarantee that minimum essential standard of living for people. And again, in terms of moving in that direction, to benchmark social welfare payments to at least 27.5% of the average wages. And the reason we have that quite specific 27.5% is because it lines up with the agreement that had been in place for 30% of gross wages. So at a national level, they are some of the kind of high-level policy recommendations that we would make. In terms of local level, for local authorities and what they could do, support the development of social and affordable housing on state lands, because obviously if you're secure in your home, if you're secure in your tenancy, a lot can flow from that to improve your quality of life. Seek to replace the local property tax with a site value tax. That's a more equitable solution. It would increase the tax take while also including hardship measures for those who can't afford to pay it. And just to look at how we regulate our tax structures to make sure that they are as progressive as they can be across the board. In terms of the SDG for No Hunger, SDG 2, to fund research on food poverty. So we talked about the fact that Ireland is second only to the UK in terms of our adult obesity rate. And that is a product of the fact that cheaper foods are less nutritionally dense. So if we want people to really have a more sustainable diet and look at that, we need to research behind, what are the drivers there? What are people spending on foods? Where can we actually promote healthy and sustainable living? And there's a wealth of data out there already. So in terms of the work that the Vincentian Partnership do when they're looking at their minimum essential standard of living, they have focus groups and basket of goods that go down to calorie-based nutritional data. There would also be the St Vincent de Paul, who would engage with low-income families and households around their budgets and their needs, and who would have, the vouchers for exceptional needs in terms of buying things like groceries. And then obviously the Money Advice and Budgeting Service, who would go into a huge amount of detail on people's actual budgets and where their spending is, and really to look at researching all of those data sets to come up with a solution in relation to food poverty. To expand the Hot School Meals programme, particularly for schools and preschools in disadvantaged areas, or areas where there's a high proportion of children who are experiencing homelessness or who are living in direct provision, and for whom one hot meal a day may actually be all they're getting. So one nutritionally based meal, at least guaranteeing that, would go a long way. In terms of the local level then, providing funding for research on local initiatives. So rural needs would be quite different perhaps in terms of what needs to be done in terms of sustainability than rural area or than urban areas. So looking at sustainable food production at that level and supporting farm to fork initiatives and short supply chains in food production. Onwards then to the health goal at national level to actually implement Sláinte Care. So it's been knocking around since 2016. It got cross-government support. It really needs to be implemented on the ground. And invest in primary care networks to increase the number of community beds, to increase supports to carers, and to increase the home care package, provision of which is grossly underfunded. We'd also advocate for the introduction of the right to home care in legislation. At a local level then, to support the integration of primary care networks and GP-led community healthcare at a community level, and also to support the rollout of Smile Agus Sláinte, so that's the dentistry and orthodontics arm of the Sláinte Care programme as part of primary care provision. Looking at quality education, and notwithstanding the fact that we score quite high in relation to this goal, there is still work to be done to address educational disadvantage. So what we would be advocating for would be the delivery of a long-term, sustainable and appropriately funded education strategy that takes that whole person approach from early years right through to lifelong learning and in-work supports, to make combating educational disadvantage a priority. And there's a body of work out there in terms of the educational research that has been done on DEIS schools and why gaps still remain for their, between those and their more affluent student peers. Commit to increasing investment in early childhood care and education by 0.1% annually to meet the OECD average by 2025. And develop a framework to deliver sustainable funding revenues in line with the Castle's report for higher education over the next 5 years with a roadmap to 2028. At local level then, to support high quality community childcare, particularly again in disadvantaged areas. And there are some great initiatives. There's one here, for example, that could be used as a model. To enhance community education programmes and lifelong learning through the library network, and to fully implement the library strategy, our Public Libraries 2022, to ensure that it's inclusive and ensure that it includes the local smaller branches. On gender equality, to introduce legislation to support flexible and remote working, and I know that there are some moves in that direction already in terms of consultations that are being undertaken, but they need to be expedited, they need to be driven. To make all sanitary products exempt from VAT. So the majority of them are, but the more sustainable newer products on the market are still subject to VAT. To deliver high quality community childcare, again as part of an educational package, and to individualise and equalise social welfare payments. Now, some discussions in relation to the roadmap for social inclusion, there are some moves in that direction, but how that's actually going to work in terms of not only individualising payments, but equalising them in order to truly address that poverty gap. And introduce a universal state social welfare pension. And we have a lot of information and work on our website in that regard. At a local level, to actively promote gender equality in local authority elections, on boards and their committees of strategic importance. So their LCDCs, their SPCs, their JPCs, all of the committees that local authorities engage in, to ensure that that gender quota is driven down. And to introduce family-friendly working hours and conditions for councillors and local authority staff. In terms of clean water and sanitation, to continue to provide support and advice to farmers to improve water quality under the Agricultural Sustainability Support and Advice Programme, and to invest in Ireland's wastewater system. At a local level then, to develop a drinking water safety plan following EPA guidelines, and those guidelines are extensive, for each public water supply, identifying all of the potential risks and detailing the mitigation and control measures, and obviously supporting that with local authority funding. In terms of renewable energy, to upgrade the national grid and invest in infrastructure that's necessary to support a transition to a more sustainable renewable energy source, and to invest in research and development for the use of renewable energy in public transport systems. So there's a lot of discussion around electricity and how much that might take in terms of electrifying public transport. We need to really engage with the whole spectrum of renewable energy in order to drive that agenda forward. At a local level, to invest in renewable energy transition programmes for local authority offices and their community spaces to try and drive that. I mean, there are some things happening in terms of local authority accommodation, particularly in the Midlands area following last year's budget, but we really need to see that expanded out into community spaces as well. In terms of good jobs and economic growth, to develop a programme of in-work learning for those most at risk of losing their jobs. So we know, for example, that there are going to be a cohort of people who are currently in work whose jobs will be affected by automisation and globalisation. They are, however, the least likely to be in lifelong learning. So the lifelong learning opportunities tend to be available or tend to be taken up by people in managerial and professional sectors, whereas what we need is across the spectrum of all roles to really ensure that if there are risks and we can see them down the line, that they are being mitigated against. To adopt policies to address youth unemployment, to recognise that the term work is not synonymous with a job, and again that would feed into our policy recommendations in relation to caring, but also in relation to gender equality. To develop a national index of progress that looks beyond economic growth, and we heard very eloquently from Charlie as to why that's absolutely necessary, and include environmental and social factors. To introduce shadow national accounts and assign a value to natural capital and ecosystems in our natural accounting systems. And to integrate a sustainable development framework into economic policy. At a local level then, we need to review the sustainability of the jobs created under LEOs and job path programmes and develop plans to ensure the security of decent work. Moving on then to SDG 9. And all of these recommendations, I know this is a continuing whistle-stop tour, but all of these recommendations are in the index that you would have received this morning. At a national level, to invest in initiatives that strengthen social infrastructure, so schools, primary care centres, social housing and so on, and ensure that they are all collaborative. And to support a minimum corporation tax of 6%, so that large corporations and multinationals are contributing to the sustainability of the communities in which they're situated, so that it's not a case of, investing in these large buildings, bringing staff from overseas in order to fulfil a workforce, and having these kind of co-living style properties and short-term lettings to facilitate all of that. What we need is that there is investment back into communities and that it's a real integration if we want sustainable infrastructure. At a local level, to expedite the rollout of the National Broadband Plan, commencing with those which are with the largest proportion of premises dependent on it. And again, that would obviously feed into in terms of flexible and remote working capabilities, and improve the primary road networks across the country. To reduce inequalities, to fully implement what is there in terms of the roadmap for social inclusion, but also, as I said earlier on when we discussed SDG 1, to review the targets that are set out within that policy document. To fully implement the recommendations of last year's Commission report on the eradication of, or the elimination of racial discrimination, because we have lagged behind in terms of our reporting to that Commission, let alone in terms of implementing its recommendations, and we have a long way to go there. To expedite legislation on hate crime and hate speech. At a local level, to utilise the full allocation of traveller-specific, or for traveller-specific accommodation. So traveller-specific accommodation suffers from something that the rest of the housing sector really doesn't suffer from, in terms of there's no money. The money is there, it has been allocated, but local authorities are not drawing it down, and that needs to be addressed. And to fully implement the National Traveller and Roma Inclusion Strategy at a local level. In terms of supporting sustainable cities and communities, aim to make 20% of all housing social housing, in line with our other European peers, our European countries, to shift investment from family hubs to housing first as a long-term strategy to eliminating homelessness, as they have done in Finland very successfully. And to support community programmes such as sports initiatives, playgrounds, recreational centres and libraries to sustain communities. So again, there's a whole body of research in the psychological sphere in relation to the importance of outdoor play, the importance of safe spaces, and the reason why children in disadvantaged areas are not participating in sport and are not, getting that outdoor activity that they need. And a lot of it is to do with the initiatives that are not there and the spaces that are not safe. In terms of the local level, invest in deep retrofitting programmes for community spaces, ring-fence continued funding to encourage sports participation and active lifestyle programmes, and again we'd advocate for a priority to be given in terms of disadvantaged areas where it could do the most good, and to invest in the provision and maintenance of community spaces, playgrounds and youth centres. On responsible consumption, to introduce a circular economy package for Ireland across all areas of economic activity. And there is a boilerplate version of that from Finland, again, that's been put forward by the European Commission for the last number of years. We really just need to take it on and adopt it. To research cradle-to-cradle development in terms of sustainable materials, to place a levy on single-use plastics, and to invest in the development of short supply chains. At a local level, to eliminate the use of all single-use plastics from local authority buildings and community public spaces, to develop open consultations on ambitious waste management plans beyond 2021, and to adopt the principles of a circular economy, particularly for construction and demolition, but across the product space. There are some great initiatives. There's one out in Ballymun, for example, that deals with a whole circular economy and sustainability of materials. And so again, there are blueprints there that can be adopted. In terms of climate action, and we have a huge amount of work to do there, we need to develop a just transition dialogue. So there needs to be a whole stakeholder approach to looking at just transition. There is no point in individual silos here. We need to really tackle this and tackle it as an integrated issue. And to develop a comprehensive, from that, mitigation and transition programme to transition to a low carbon economy. At a local level, to develop climate change adaptation strategies, and this was something that was put forward in the local government strategies within each local authority area, with collaborative input from local communities, the public participation networks, and support that with a dedicated funding stream and a funding line into the medium and long term. In terms of life below water, to fully implement the National Integrated Maritime Plan, to regulate harvesting and end overfishing, and to implement policies to restore fishing stocks to sustainable levels. At a local level, to put in place a plan to tackle pesticides in drinking water, and to implement the nature programmes that are set out in the Climate Action Plan that was published by the Department of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment. In terms of life on land, to increase afforestation of native trees and reduce planting of Sitka spruce. So even with that low level of afforestation at 11%, what is being planted is over 50% of non-native, and that is having an effect on the biosphere in those areas. So we need to look at not only the level of planting, but actually what it is that we're planting and the impact that it's having. To develop environmentally sustainable farming practices. And then at a local level to invest in programmes in terms of the boglands and re-wetting, to implement the nature programme set out in the Climate Action Plan. In terms of peace and justice, to increase social dialogue and expand the national economic dialogue to a range of other policy areas. And this is something that Sean in particular has been very vocal on for a number of years. To restore funding to the community and voluntary pillar, to review planning legislation to ensure that its terms are consistent with the objectives of the goals. So, for example, a recent heads of a bill that was published by the Department of Housing would have limited the capacity of smaller groups and environmental groups to raise objections and to discuss planning applications, and to increase funding for civil legal aid. At a local level, to develop a sustainable strategy for public participation. So public participation and public participation networks in particular are across all of the 31 local authority areas. They're included in quite a number of government strategies, but they don't have a real robust strategy as and of themselves. So to get that strategy and underpin it with associated budgets, moving from an annual funding stream to a 3 to 5 year renewable commitment. And finally, to increase ODA as a percentage of GNI with a move towards the UN target. And we would say we should be moving towards the UN target by 2025. To adopt targets and reporting systems for the Sustainable Development Goals. To tag all government policies and policy proposals with the relevant goal or goals. And to focus on securing policy coherence. Several aspects of government policy are at odds with the goals. So to really look at, how they progress the goals when we're talking about policy. At a local level then, to develop strategic partnerships with local authorities and local government organisations in Europe and internationally to support the implementation of the goals and to ensure coherence between national and local government policies. Thank you.
And another tour de force from Colette on this. Brings us into the whole area of the policy implications of the results of the study and where we stand compared to the EU, other EU 15 countries across all of the 17 goals. In it, I think there are something like 56 recommendations under the 17 goals at national level, and there's about 33 or 34 at a local level in that listing that Colette did there, took you through. Obviously, at an immediate level, I refer back to the point I made at the beginning that we are actually at the moment of discussing, having almost a national conversation maybe, about what should be in a new programme for government. Not just about who should form the government, but what should be in that programme, because that's the critical issue at the end of the day. And not just being in the programme, but delivering on it, of course, at the end of the day. These are, I would suggest, every single one of the proposals here is a doable proposal that could be contained in a programme. So I'm just putting that out there. Obviously, we have an interest in this. But anyway, we will move to questions, and we have a few minutes here still. And obviously, there might be questions that are still hanging over from earlier on, but there obviously there might be some serious questions, policy questions that arise. I see a lot of hands here, so we'll start with. We'll take 3 or 4, and we'll come back and we'll come back and do another round and another round until we wrap up. At the latest, we're wrapping at 12:30. Thanks.
All right, thanks very much. Thanks very much. Tony Brennan is my name, Fingal Public Participation Network. It's just a question on direct provision centres. I don't know whether it's right to say it this, but what role, if any, does the public participation networks throughout the country have in relation to people living in direct provision centres? Or is that in social inclusion, or is there any role to play by the PPN? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Denise Boyle. Thank you very much to all the presenters. I was just thinking it's a massive programme, the 17 SDGs, and trying to implement them, and obviously they're significant and important. Has there been any thought of maybe for 2 years just focusing on a small number of SDGs? I think it was Ban Ki-moon who said if SDG 16 was implemented, we wouldn't need any of the other goals. So, Sean just mentioned the programme for government. So, if you think poverty, health, homelessness, if we took the 16 plus 2 or 3 other goals, could we be more effective and really achieve something rather than spreading right across the 17? Thank you.
Okay. Just beside you there, Fergus.
My question is related.
Introduce.
Oh, Fergus.
I know you're well known.
Fergus O'Farrell. My question is related to the last one. It's government bandwidth or capacity. We've in the last half decade added nearly 500,000 new jobs. So we've 2,000,038 people at work. That has put enormous pressure on housing and other transport and other things. The government didn't have the bandwidth to deal with Brexit and employment creation and finances and so on. How do you propose to get efficacy into the state system that it can actually deal with all these issues at the same time?
Oh, I take one more when I'm watching gender. Is there? Yes, over here in the corner. I'm trying to keep a gender balance here. Good, thank you.
Hi, yes, Sarah Franklin from Coalition 2030, and thank you very much for the presentation. And just to perhaps highlight one of the ways that we might be looking at engaging with some of these goals is through the DCCAE's SDGs National Stakeholder Forum, which is held 4 times a year. And one of the big focus points for this year's series of stakeholder fora is to shape the policy around the national implementation plan, which is being done throughout this year. So it's a real opportunity for civil society and for all working groups to come together and input and submit in ways that we can actually look at the different goals, but not all at once. So each of the fora will be designed to take maybe 2 or 3 goals, and each department that's responsible for that particular goal or goals will be at those meetings. So it'll be very much a sort of planning meeting, workshop style rather than a presentation.
I'll come back in a moment to more questions. There's quite a lot of other people want in, but let's take the 4 of those first. So the first one was the PPN issue and people living in direct provision. And
so I take that. I mean, Tony, I think, as you know, I'm very supportive of the PPNs. I think they should be into everything. But I think, particularly in relation to the direct provisions, there certainly is a role for the public participation networks, because what they do is allow for integration into the community. They know their member organisations. They know who's best placed to give supports. They know the power of communities. So a really good example was actually what happened last year in Clare with Clare PPN. And it was something simple. It didn't have to be kind of a huge initiative. It was coffee mornings. It was, meet and greets with people. And it really helped to integrate people living in direct provision within their communities. It helped to build community with them. So certainly I would agree that there is a role for public participation networks to play in that space.
Moving on to the second one.
In terms of the focusing on a small number of SDGs, I think some of the problems we have and continue to have is the fact that we don't look at an integrated approach, that we look in silos. So we concentrate really hard on the economy, and then the social side of things fall to the wall. The SDGs are designed in such a way that they're all interdependent. So while you can talk about indicators and you can talk about, proposals under each individual one, they'll all have a knock-on effect onto each other. So certainly I think we would certainly advocate that they shouldn't be kind of split in that way, that they should actually be looked at as a series of goals, of policy goals that can help support government to really address all of the issues that we're facing at the moment. I might let Sean respond to Fergus's.
I think the issue about government bandwidth is just an issue that government has to get its act together on and stop this issue of saying, well, we have this and we're not going to do beyond that, and we're going to take a kind of a minimal kind of engagement. The reality is that government needs to face up to the fact that Ireland has a deficit in services and in infrastructure. It obviously has a serious problem on environment and climate that this index shows in stark numbers. And we're not doing all that. We're doing well on a few things, but we're not doing all that well in a lot of things. Now, the reality there is that these things are not going to be rectified without the resources being made available. If you want to hear Social Justice Ireland's a much more extended version of it than what I'm saying now, read this morning's Irish Times. Michelle Murphy, who was here earlier on but had to leave, she one of our colleagues, she has an article there showing why, if we're going to deal with housing and healthcare and some of these other issues, that it's going to involve facing the tax issue. Now, it's not about saying that all of these issues have to be dealt with by increasing taxation. Of course not, because there are serious efficiency issues in quite a number of these areas, okay? And there's also serious integration issues. You know, going back to what Colette has been talking about in silos, if you break down some of those silos, you actually get a lot of sort of, you know, positive developments in the expenditure side. But at the end of the day, we're not going to be able to generate European levels of infrastructure and services with United States levels of taxation. That's a circle you cannot square. So from our perspective, it's very important that government capacity, government bandwidth is an issue that government just has to take on and stop pretending that minimalist government solves the problem when it darn well doesn't. I don't know whether Charlie wants to talk about, because he would come from a country with a fair bit of experience of the kind of consequences of minimal government in some ways.
Inefficient government is rarely an accident. I mean, it's a policy. If you show the government can't solve any problems, then you don't have to worry about the government solving any problems. I mean, this is what Ronald Reagan brought the United States. But I did want to talk about reducing to just one or two goals. I've been working at the United Nations for this period where we went from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals, because I was part of the Sustainable Development Committee, and also my favorite, the Statistical Commission, which are the people who measure everything. And everything started out with, driven by scientists who had, there's only two statistics that matter. There's temperature rise and biodiversity. And for them, everything else is a footnote. And there was a huge reaction to their first proposals because poverty did not make the list. And all these member countries are like, what is going on here? And then the NGOs were, you know, there's a huge reaction. And things are usually very dull at the United Nations, but that was not a dull meeting. And so there's always a balance, but you know, you do have experts who their issue can take over. And of course, temperature rise and biodiversity are incredibly important. And you know, if there's no planet, everything else does become irrelevant. However, you just can't look at, well, we could save the planet, because the easiest way to save the planet is to get rid of people. And you know, we're saving the planet for people to live on. And you know, so you always have that balance to try to keep everything is interconnected. And I mean, my whole work as an economist is to argue that the economy is part of society, and to separate them is just artificial, because now the economy and society are part of an environment. To separate them is completely artificial. But we're just not at the stage where you can then look at them all interconnected to a general audience has been told, well, we have the economy need over here, and we have society that's over here, and then we have the planet over here. So, you know, it's a process to try to get that integration just in the public discourse so that you can start having these interconnected dialogues.
If we wanted one kind of example of why that's so important, look at what's happened in Ireland over the last 10 years. Like, we have driven an extraordinary, though maybe in some ways dubious issues, around economic growth. And we certainly have had, we now have a thriving economy. The problem is we didn't do the other stuff. You must do this stuff simultaneously. That, for me, would be the most important, well, sorry, one of the two most important issues. The other important issue for us would be that everything that is put into a program for government, every initiative must be sustainable in the long run. It must be sustainable environmentally, it must be sustainable economically, and it must be sustainable socially. There's no point in building a society nobody wants to live in. I mean, that's codology. So, like, we have to be working with all three at the same time. Let's go to some more questions. Yourself, yeah, okay. Yes, there. Okay, the mic is right there.
Thank you very much to speakers, organizers, and everything. I really enjoyed it, and I have no question, really. Mine is just an observation and an appeal. I really enjoy the coffee out there, and I know that when we are talking about these SDGs, there are things which we expect authorities to do and things which we can look at. So my appeal is it possible that in future we ask the host venues to provide proper cups so that we'll avoid the single use, and in that way we'll be drinking our teas and coffees with a clear conscience, feeling that we have contributed to the environment. Thank you very much.
Just to say to you, we're on that case already. That has been brought to our notice. Now, we have no control over that. We just rent the place. But we will certainly be noting that for future events. We actually have taken some serious steps in other conferences and things, not here, but that we do in other venues, and we're down the road on it, but we're certainly noting it for here. Thanks for that. Okay, yourself, you've been trying to get in here for a while, and then yourself, okay?
Thank you. I'm Des Henley. I work with the Irish Development Education Association. Development education is what we do, or often known as GCE as well. So SDG Target 4.7 is where the subject matter of what we do is covered within the overall SDG agenda. And our argument is that it's having a society that understands how the world works and is motivated by values of justice and equality and sustainability is really important to sustain support socially for the entire SDG agenda, and particularly when we hit crisis situations, as we have done in the past, where the established political players and institutions tend to have a default response of cutting deep into the policies and programs that support the broad SDG agenda. So having a population that has its own motivations and will mobilize in support of the SDGs in those situations is critically important to having the long-term sustained support that's needed. So that's a precursor to a question. It's whether you manage to have a look down to the detail of Target 4.7 in particular, and if you have a view on just how important a priority that should be. Thanks.
Okay. And just next to you there.
Thanks.
Okay.
Hi, sorry, my name is Rebecca. I'm a student at the moment. But what I found really interesting was the disparity with how highly Ireland ranks on the education SDG, but then we have statistics like it's in the bottom 3 for women in senior management roles. So I'm wondering if there's any room for policy in the education realm that would encourage or foster entrepreneurial activities or leadership activities in women, or young women, I mean.
Thank you, that's good. Okay, we come over on this side here, this gentleman here.
Hello, Keith Mulvey from Athboy Development Forum, a small rural community of 3,000 inhabitants, and we have about 65 community groups. My question is there a forum where small rural communities can report emerging risks relating to the ongoing implementation of the SDGs from a grassroots level in order to help the ministers and local authorities make informed decisions on their policy and strategy design and the policy implementations?
and then I'll come back to you. Okay, no, there, and, yeah, okay, do them the other way. All right.
John Fitzgibbon.
Okay,
I'm a follower of Social Justice Ireland and amongst other groups. The point I want to make is that we have a lot of competition and competition now in the Dáil between the different parties is to try and ensure that they will do better the next time if there is another election or when there is another election. Why do we need them to compete? They should be getting together as a team, the whole lot of them, and using the best talent that is there to progress the situation. I've seen this going on now for a long, long time, since I'm in my 80s, and I think is absolutely stupid. Now, you mentioned the point that we're high on the education, that we're doing well on the education thing. If we were doing well on education, we wouldn't have had the problems we've had in the past, all the different depressions and so on like that. What we have is a system of training, and education does not enter into it. So I think we should be looking at the Paulo Freire sort of situation and other similar people who have put forward decent, what would you say, methods of education and training, and the effect of that was seen quite clearly in South America. So read Paulo Freire, people. I couldn't tell you any more about it now. Thank you.
Okay. Just one more before we come back.
I'll be very quick. Auntie McGuire here from TU Dublin, Kevin Street, Bolton Street. Fantastic presentations. I've been following you for a good few years, and I think the work you're doing is fantastic. There's obviously the quant side, and then there's policy implications. But if you take any strand, and as you were saying, they're all intertwined, and I can pull out examples, millions of them. So, for example, cheap air flights, carbon emissions, it affects tourism in every quarter. How do we move, or do you have any thoughts on, obviously there's the measurements, there's the policy implications, but how do we do it on the ground? How do you engage people to say, well, our tourism angle has to change? Another example, for example, you could take any strand, the farmers, growing cows versus growing trees. How do we achieve it? Have you any thoughts of a forum or a platform that could help encourage the dialogue in a sensible manner?
I think we should maybe bring that back. We have about 5 questions, four anyway, 5 actually. So Des Handy's question about SDG 4.7. This is the issue about values and how important they are and so on. Does anybody want to take that, or would I just to say, I don't have the detail of the actual measurement because Catherine is the person who did that with Niamh. But I can say this very clearly. Values are absolutely critical from our perspective. And that's why we as an organisation in Social Justice Ireland would be very strongly focused on core values of like social justice and fairness and so on. And the reason is the reason that you actually mentioned yourself, which is that from going beyond the fact that this is the right thing to do anyway, it actually is key as well to getting public support. Because people are not prepared to support initiatives if they don't feel that at the end of the day they're going to get a fairer, more just outcome. And certainly when you look at the kind of divisions and the inequality that has been growing, I think a lot of the response that we're getting in elections and so on and in voting patterns goes back to the issue of people not being happy with the fact that while they're living in a very rich country, these divisions are deepening instead of being dealt with. So we have divisions on housing, we have divisions on health that everybody is talking about and aware of and so on. But there's a lot of other divisions as well, and a few of them came out in the discussion here already. The critical issue here is that policy and policy decisions, programs for government and so on, government decisions, national and local, must all be driven clearly by values that have public support and can be supported. So I think that would be critical.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of what's in the index on that itself, it isn't one of the indicators, specifically in relation to 4.7. And again, as Sean said, like with Catherine not being here, but I presume it's on the basis that it wasn't across the EU 15, that there wasn't a measurement that was capable of being compared in that way. But I would absolutely mirror what you say and agree with it in terms of the need for a values-led approach. And I think that leads into what John was saying in relation to this competition element of at all levels. And, you know, really if we had a values-based, a society-based educational mind frame, that we wouldn't be looking at necessarily individual ambitions or ideological ambitions, that we would be looking at, well, what kind of society do we actually want to live in, and be basing our policies and our approaches on that. In terms of Rebecca's question in relation to, you know, room for policy for young women, absolutely. I think in terms of, you know, we looked at education and we saw, for example, that women do better than men in terms of the educational attainment, but that's just not bearing out on boards and committees. And there's a huge amount of factors, and I suppose it probably goes back to the earlier question on why we need to have all of the SDGs, because, you know, really to take up participation, we need to look at things like, you know, childcare, we need to look at things like housing, we need to look at things like remote working, we need to look at things like opportunities. So it's, you know, it spreads, that type of policy development spreads across a range of the SDGs, but there are others doing it, you know, and we should be looking at them and learning from them that it is actually possible. It just needs the political will behind it to get it off the ground. In terms of the Forum for Emerging Risks, I am not sure if there is a specific one in relation to the SDGs. Sarah mentioned the SDG Stakeholder Forum, and we're part of that as well. And also that, you know, that there's an SDG geo-hive that the department are operating at the moment, and they've got SDG champions. So they ask for local level initiatives to feed into all of that. And that is possibly a way. But also in terms of looking at, well, how policy is driven. So one of our key policy documents would be around the national budget. And that's open to everybody to feed into and to make submissions on. So, you know, it's about education for community groups on how they engage with the political systems they have, and using those and using the opportunities that are available to them to really bring these things to the forefront.
I think there's an issue that is critical here. I don't believe you can run a modern democracy without engaging all the sectors of society. And for the last 10 years, we've been trying to do that. In fact, we have been doing it. But the shambles that we have out there on so many things is a result of the failure to involve large sections of society. And the aggressive and negative and angry reaction of many people to the current situation goes back to the issue that they're not engaged at all, and their views aren't taken into consideration, really. Now, to do that, we need a forum for dialogue. And like we in Social Justice Ireland have been really, Colette is tired of listening to me, and Eamon and all the rest of them are tired of listening to me going on about this. But like, we need a forum for social dialogue that involves all the sectors of society. We have a small kind of amount of it, though I don't think the participants are all that happy with it, with employers and trade unions on pay. There's a certain amount of that, though not an awful lot going on. But the reality is we need all sectors of society involved in forums where people can do the things that are raised here, like that in the last questioner raised about, you know, is there anywhere that people can actually put in their kind of complaints or ideas or various suggestions or proposals where they could be discussed and argued about on the merits of the case. And we've argued all the time that we need a more participative, but beyond that type of democracy where, you know, the ammunition is left outside, where basically people can sit down, deal with the actual evidence, and built on the evidence can make proposals and suggestions and eventually decisions made that actually move on the basis of that evidence. So whether it's about the environment, whether it's about farmers being asked to sort of give up their current their current livelihood, if you like, but not being given alternatives, that type of thing, or whether it's the issue of aviation fuel that was mentioned, and that obviously needs to be dealt with, and so many other things, okay? And in that context, I take John's point as well, being a great admirer myself of Paulo Freire. I like the way he actually summarized an adult's view or approach should be to have the capacity, and education should be that one has the capacity to read reality and to write a new reality, and that's what reading and writing is about at the end of the day. And we don't have the forums, if you like, that support that. So end of my kind of pet rant. But anyway, I'll go back to Charlie because we've left him out of these. He hasn't come in on these.
Yes, well, as I tell my students, all of economics is about values and prices. And the whole idea of having a market is that the prices we pay reflect what the goods actually cost and what they mean to people. And when they diverge, we get all sorts of problems. So the whole housing crisis came about because there's a huge gap between the actual value of the house, of replacing it, and its price, because we had this huge bubble. All the environmental problems are grounded in the fact that we are not valuing and not pricing natural resources in the environment to the extent of how much they matter for the survivability of our species. And at some point, we have to have prices reflect the actual value so that consumers will make choices based on all the information, and that we don't just shift the costs onto some other groups. So much of wealth creation has really been wealth capture. How do I shift cost onto another group? I make you have to deal with my pollution. I pay you less because you're a woman, so my income goes up. All these things create the great inequality that we're fighting and trying to deal with. But prices have to reflect the actual costs so that the people making decisions will make better decisions. And that's the only function and usefulness we can have for economists, is that they can get that to happen. Then everyone else has the information to make choices. Politicians, community, citizens, consumers. But we're so far from that because we have an economy built on generating waste, which is shifting the costs so that the cost isn't where we're actually paying things. We have to get to that level before the economy can start to make sense and sort of balance itself. On the question on women and entrepreneurship, I teach in a business school, and women outnumber men, they outperform men, yet 10 years after graduation, there's a huge difference. And so much of how their careers and their interests are steered are just so different. So that the careers that pay a lot more, particularly like in finance, I'm in the Department of Economics and Finance, when you encourage women in that field, there's a great deal of resistance because it's like, well, what am I doing here? I mean, these are all guys. This is a macho field. And if you leave the school and go to work for Goldman Sachs or any of the companies our students go to work for, it is a very macho environment, and then they're very uncomfortable. So there's just a great deal of, once you leave business school to the real world, so many of these discriminations that have to be dealt with in some sort of regulatory and aggressive way, because the culture is just such in the areas where the decisions are actually made. So in marketing, it's it's all right for women to go over there and to rise, but when it comes to controlling money, there are a lot of these barriers that, are barriers that need to be seen as barriers.
Okay. Now, I'm sorry, we're beyond the end of our broadcast time, so I'm kind of watching this. We're already several, I think that's maybe another indication that we need to pack up. I just want to say to everybody, Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for being here. Those who are here, thank you for being with us on the web, for those who are following us on the web and engaging. Just to say to you a few things. One is the full report is downloadable from our website, and it's there, and it's the whole thing is there, and you can download it for free. I want to say a very special thank you to the authors who produced this report, to Professor Charles Clark, to Dr. Catherine Kavanagh, and to Niamh Lenihan from St. John's in New York, from UCC, and from Cork Institute of Technology. They produced a fantastic piece of work. It's a superb piece of work. We're very grateful for the effort and the energy they put into it, and we're delighted to have it, and we're very, very grateful to you for producing it in the first place. I want to draw your attention to somebody I should have drawn attention to at the very beginning, which is Philip down here, our cartoonist. Those who are regulars at our conferences know that Philip does a fantastic job in turning all of these presentations and discussions into cartoons that can go up on the web and so on, and we will have a full summary of this. And we use Philip's work extensively in our socioeconomic review and on our website and all over the place. Superb capacity for communicating through images, which we appreciate. I want to say a special word to the Kairos team, who were here before 7 o'clock this morning putting all this stuff together, and who are so reliable all the time in producing the webcasts. And then we are able to put these up as on our website, so people can actually see them, and we'll eventually have the presentations out as podcasts and using all the various technology, if you like. So thanks, a very special thank you to Finbar Tracy and his team. I want to say a special thank you to Sheila Curran and to Margot Delaney, who helped us with registration, with microphones, and with a whole lot of other stuff. And a very special thank you to Colette Bennett, who stepped in very late in the day and did a fantastic job. So we thank you for that. And now I'm going to embarrass somebody by saying the person behind all of this, who has actually led on this, is Eamon Murphy, our colleague, and he's down there somewhere. He's outside on the phone, but anyway, not to worry. We thank him as well. Finally, just a very special thank you to all our participants. We really appreciate your participation with us. We're always open to ideas and suggestions, and contact us. You know that a lot of people do this all the time, and we will try to stay in constant contact with you and keep the material up to date all the time, so you can have relevant and bang up to date material to try to impact on decision making out there, making a difference for everybody, so that we can in effect produce a fairer, more just society. Thank you to everybody involved.